In this video, we're going to learn about conditional actions. We assume that you're already familiar with the topics covered in the Getting Started videos. First, we will set up a conditional action on this radio button object so that if they get it incorrect, we get some negative feedback, or if the correct choice is made, we get some positive feedback. Next, we'll set up some back and next buttons and make sure that on page 1, our back button is disabled, but when we leave page 1, it enables. And similarly, for our next button, when we arrive on the last page of our lesson, it becomes disabled, and if we leave the last page, it re-enables. So here we are in a new blank lesson, and we're already familiar with how to set up basic actions. For example, if we had a button object, and when that is clicked, we want to show a check mark. So for a quick review, we would select the button and grab the when do block, and then select our check mark and grab the show block. But what happens if we only want to show the check mark when certain conditions are met? For example, let's make this a little bit more complicated and add a radio button object. Now, if we were building a proper question inside of a quiz, we would probably apply a template. But let's just set up a simple case here using these objects on the screen. So let's say we only want to show this check mark when answer 2 is selected, or choice 2. So we don't have a simple when and do anymore. We also have to check to see what the state of our radio button is in. So we can do this by selecting the radio button and grabbing this if, do, else block. This one's pre-populated with the radio selected index equals 1. If we just wanted the if block, we could find that in the control section, which just has these blocks by themselves. But in our case, we'll go back to the radio button and grab this if, do, else block. And in this case, we want to check to see if the radio button selected index is equal to 2. So what we can do is place that within our when do block. And now we have a space for when that condition is true, and another space for when that condition is false. If we look at the different parts of our if, do, else block, we can see what it's doing. So this block here is always going to return the selected index. So at runtime, if nothing is selected, it would return 0. If choice 1 was selected, it would return 1. If choice 3 were selected, it would return 3. So what we're doing is we're checking to see if the selected index is equal to the number 2. And if that is the case, then this entire portion will return true. And if that returns true, then it will do the things in the do block. So we can just grab our show and place it in here. Now I need to uncheck the start visible property. So I'll select my check mark, come up to the properties, and uncheck start visible. And then we can preview this and test it out. So right now, if I click the button, I get nothing. If I choose some random answer choice, I get nothing. But if I choose choice 2 and click the button, then I get my check mark. So let's expand on this activity a little bit more. And let's add an X mark. So I'll select that, add one to my page, and I'll uncheck the start visible property for that as well. And I'm going to rename these objects, so I'll call this check and X. From here, I can grab the show X mark block, and I can put this in my else section. Now, when they click on button 1, if the radio button selected index is equal to the one that I care about, in this case 2, then I'm going to show my check mark. Otherwise, if it's anything else, I'll show the X mark. And we can preview this again. And now if I don't make a selection and click the button, I get my X mark. If I get something wrong, the X mark is still there, but it's being shown again. And once I get it right, then I get my check mark. So from here, we could add a few more actions just to clean up. So I will select my X mark and grab the hide, put it in there, and grab my check mark and grab the hide and put it in my else. So now only one of these objects will be shown. Let's look at another example. Let's say we have multiple pages in our lesson, so I'll go ahead and add a new page. And I'll just toss a shape on there so that we can see what page we're on, and add a few more. So we have some pages here with some placeholder content on them, and we'll probably need some buttons in order to navigate through our pages. So we'll create those. And on page 1, we'll probably want to disable our back button. And on the last page of our lesson, we'll want to disable the next button. So to do this, we'll go to our master. And here on the master, I will create some back and next buttons. So I'll come up to my button object, put a button there, call it back, create another button, change the label to next, and place it in the top right-hand corner. Then I'll set up the actions to make those work. So next on click, go to the page category and say go to next page. And set up a similar action for our back button. So back on click, and page, go to previous page. So this would enable navigation through our 5 pages, but when we're on page 1, we'll want to disable our back button. And again, this is where our conditional actions will come in handy. Note that we have master templates that would take care of all of this for us, but we're building this from scratch as part of a learning exercise. So let's focus on this back button. And I can go to the Page tab and choose the When Page on Load. So I'll add one of those. And I'm going to add a second trigger here. So I'll click this green plus and say when the page loads and when the page changes. So in order to get the page on change, I can just right-click, duplicate, and add that here. And then I can change it from the drop-down to on change. So now, when the lesson first loads up, or whenever we switch pages, we're going to do the things in the do space. So we don't want to disable our back button anytime the page changes, but only on certain pages, page 1. So I again need a conditional. So I'll go up to the Control tab and grab this if do else block. So I'll grab that and put it in here. It comes with this helpful equals stub, which I will end up using, so we'll keep that around. And I will return to the Page tab, and this time I care about which page we're on. So I'll scroll down here until I find the page number block, and I'll grab that and put it in here. So just like with the radio button, the page number will always return the current page number. So if I'm on page 1, it will return 1. If I'm on page 10, it would return 10. So the page number that we care about in this case is page 1. So I'll type in 1 here. And now, when the current page number is equal to 1, the things in the do portion will happen. If we're on any other page, things in the else portion will happen. So right now, I can click on my back button and grab the set back, which is the name of the button, enabled to false. So I can add this into my do portion. Now when we're on page 1, my back button will be disabled. So we can go back to the flow, and I'll preview this from page 2. So I'll go to page 2 and click on preview. And to start with, my back button is enabled, but as soon as I click on it and return to page 1, it becomes disabled. In this case, the disabled state is grayed out. So that's exactly what we want, but we run into a bit of an issue if I proceed through the lesson. My back button is never told to re-enable. So once it's disabled, it's stuck that way. So let's return to our master. And this is where the else portion will come in handy. So if we're on any other page except for page 1, I want my back button to become enabled once more. So I'll right-click on this action block and say duplicate. And I'll change this false to true. And put that in the else block. So what this action is doing is when the lesson first loads, or whenever we switch pages, we're checking to see if we're on page 1. If we are, we're going to disable our back button. If we're on any other page, we're going to enable our back button. So from here, we can set up a very similar action for our next button. Rather than creating a whole new action, or even duplicating this action, we can just add into it. So all I really need is this if block, so I can right-click on it and say duplicate, and I'll add this to the same when block. So from here, I'll change the drop-down to point to the next button. And in this case, we don't want to check to see if we're on page 1 to disable our next button and or re-enable it. In this case, we need to check to see if we're on the last page. Currently, I have 5 pages in my lesson, so I could manually change this from 1 to 5. But if I ever add or delete pages, I need to remember to come back here and update this number. A much smarter idea is to find out how many total pages we have. And we can do that by going to the Page tab and scrolling down to the last block, which is the total page count. So I'll add that in here. And now we're checking to see if the current page equals the total number of pages. So if we're on page 1, we'd be checking to see if 1 equals 5. If we were on page 4, we would check to see if 4 equals 5. And finally, if we were on the last page, in our case 5, we would check to see if 5 equals 5. And in that case, we want to disable our next button. If we're on any other page, that's when the else portion would fire. So that would re-enable our next button. So let's return to our flow and preview from page 1. So here on page 1, our back button is disabled. If we move forward, it becomes re-enabled. If we return to page 1, it again becomes disabled. And if we make it to the last page in our lesson, our next button is disabled. That should give you a basis for creating conditional actions. Keep an eye out for future tutorials that will explore more complex examples using conditional actions.